Here's a shock for you. Medieval peasants faced such brutal work that life expectancy often barely reached past 40, with injury or exhaustion claiming many early. No one thought of safety standards or a day off. If you broke your back in a field or got mangled by a millstone, that was just your lot in life. I'm laying bare the harsh truth of medieval jobs, where every task tested your survival. From grueling labor to unimaginable conditions, let's talk about work that makes your worst day seem like a holiday. Stick with me to see what it meant to live and toil under a system that owned you completely. Let's step into the muddy boots of a medieval serf and see what it really meant to live under a system that controlled your every move. We're talking about serfdom, a life where you weren't owned like merchandise, but were tied by law to the manor, with no chance to walk away. Imagine being glued to a single piece of earth, your entire existence dictated by the whims of a lord. This wasn't just a job. It was a trap that most couldn't escape, no matter how much they wished for something better. Picture yourself bound to a specific plot of land, unable to leave the manor without the lord's permission. There was no legal document granting you freedom of movement, nothing to say you could seek a better life elsewhere. Serfs weren't slaves in the strictest sense, not traded at auctions, but the difference felt thin. Your home, your family, every part of your world was rooted to that soil. If you ever thought of leaving for a neighboring village, you'd be breaking the law, risking harsh punishment just for daring to dream. Here's a chilling detail. When the land was sold, so was your fate. Under 13th century English conveyancing, when manors changed hands, customary tenants like serfs were compelled to accept new lords under the same grueling conditions. A new lord didn't just mean a new face, it could bring harsher rules or more back-breaking demands. Maybe he'd reorder the manor, separating your family on a whim. You had no voice in this, no way to protest. Think about the sinking feeling of seeing a stranger take over, knowing he now held power over every corner of your life. Imagine waking up each day, the weight of obligation crushing you before you even step outside. You owed the Lord labor, a hefty share of your crops, and whatever else he demanded just to keep living on land that was never truly yours. Every hour you spent sweating in the fields, every bit of grain you harvested, a big chunk went to someone who didn't toil alongside you. If you couldn't meet those demands, trouble came fast. Fines, beatings, or worse. You were essentially paying for the right to survive, and the cost was everything you had. Historical accounts showed just how brutal this life was. During peak seasons like harvest, serfs worked up to 12 hours a day, bent over in scorching heat or freezing rain. The work wasn't just tough, it was relentless, a grind that tested every ounce of your strength. You couldn't stop when your body ached. There was always more to do, and the Lord's overseers made sure you kept at it. The physical strain was visible in the bones of those who lived through it, with injuries and wear showing up in skeletal remains like those from Smith's Mary Rose finds, evidence of a life spent pushing past human limits. Now think about what this did to your body over time. Endless days of hauling, plowing, and threshing left you broken down far too soon. There were no days off to recover. Even Sundays often meant extra chores after church. If illness struck, you still had to work, because falling behind could mean starvation for your family. Osteological evidence, drawn from studies like B.M.S. Campbell's agricultural research, shows medieval peasant mortality often hit between 30 and 35 years, with joint degeneration common from the constant strain. By your 20s, your back was already bent, your hands gnarled, your life expectancy a shadow of what others higher up might hope for. And as if the daily grind wasn't enough, lords could demand extra labor whenever it suited them. If their castle needed repairs after a fight, you'd be the one hauling stones, no payment offered. If they dragged you into a feud with another noble, you'd better grab a tool and fight, because refusing wasn't an option. Defiance could mean a public flogging to scare others into line, or eviction, leaving you homeless with no safety net. Imagine living with that constant fear, knowing one misstep could strip away what little you had, with no one to stand up for you. So how did anyone keep going under a setup this harsh? It's a tough story, but the reality is, serfs endured through raw determination, often at a terrible cost. They pushed past exhaustion and injury because stopping meant disaster, hunger for their loved ones, or punishment from above. Many didn't make it far, their bodies giving out from the strain, or a minor wound turning fatal without care. You were born into this life, you struggled through it, and most likely, you died in it, passing the same burden to your children. They survived by clinging to the smallest moments of relief, a shared joke with a neighbor during a rare pause, or a brief rest on a holy day. But those flickers couldn't change the truth. The system was built to keep the Lord's wealth and power intact, not to care for your well-being. You weren't seen as a person with hopes or needs. You were just another piece of the manor, as tied to it as the fields you worked. Let's turn now to a different kind of hardship, one that's not just exhausting, but hits you in a way you can't ignore. Imagine a task so unpleasant it turns your stomach just thinking about it. Stick around, because what's coming next will make you grateful for even the worst day at your modern job. Let's turn to a job so vile it'll make you rethink every complaint about your daily grind. We're diving into cesspit cleaning, a medieval nightmare that's easily one of the foulest tasks in history. Imagine a line of work where the stench isn't just unbearable, but a constant threat, tied to preventing plague outbreaks as historical records of nighttime clearing suggest. This isn't just about a bad smell. It's about a gig that could cost you everything with one wrong step. In medieval towns, there was no plumbing to whisk away the mess. Human waste piled up in cesspits, crude holes in the ground that served as the dumping spot for every household's filth. Someone had to empty them before the overflow turned streets into disease-ridden swamps, and that grim duty fell to gong farmers, the unsung outcasts of society. As towns swelled with people, so did the waste, making this job a sickening necessity. You wouldn't believe the depths of disgust these workers faced, yet without them, urban life would have choked on its own refuse. Now picture this. You're knee-deep in a pit of raw sewage with nothing but a battered bucket, no gloves, no mask, just your bare hands against the filth. There's no safety net. If you slip, you're not just falling, you're sinking into a deadly mess with no one to haul you out. You're in cramped, pitch-black spaces, barely able to see the edge, every move a gamble. It's a far cry from anything we'd consider work today, where even the dirtiest jobs come with some kind of protection. Think about standing in that sludge. The smell so thick, it's like a physical weight, burning your eyes and throat with every breath. It's not just unpleasant, it's a suffocating assault you can't escape. Townsfolk didn't even toss you fair pay for enduring it. They just wanted the stench gone and didn't care how you managed. You're doing the most revolting task imaginable, and people still wrinkle their noses when you walk by. Your reward for keeping disease at bay? Hardly enough to keep bread on the table. Historical records show gong farmers often worked at night, a practice tied to municipal ordinances post-1350 that regulated cesspit emptying to avoid public disgust during daylight. They'd creep out under cover of darkness when the town slept, sparing everyone the sight and smell of their labor. But hiding didn't shield them from the toll. Constant exposure to human waste meant they were surrounded by pathogens, with medieval miasma theory linking bad air to outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, as seen in municipal accounts. Without any grasp of germ theory, these workers faced deadly risks they couldn't even name. Their life expectancy cut brutally short. Now consider the social sting on top of the physical danger. You're not just risking your health, you're shunned for it. People didn't thank you for keeping their town from turning into a cesspool. Instead, they treated you like you were the filth you cleaned, avoiding you at every turn. Neighbors steered clear, and whispers followed you, marking you as untouchable. You're saving lives by preventing outbreaks, yet you're met with nothing but scorn, a bitter reality for doing essential work. The harsh truth is, there were no other options for most gong farmers. Refusing the job meant starvation for you and your family, plain and simple. There were no better prospects for someone at society's lowest rung. So, you clenched your jaw, tried not to breathe too deep, and got to it, even as your body broke down. Many didn't last long, felled by disease or a tragic misstep in the pits. This wasn't just tough work, it was a desperate fight to survive another day. You'd think society would value the labor that kept plague from spreading, but that wasn't the case. The pay was miserable, often just enough for a meager meal. Gong farmers weren't hailed as vital. They were barely seen as people. Their role was crucial, yet they got no respect, no support. Just endless nights of grueling, dangerous toil. It's a stark look at how little worth was placed on those who took on the dirtiest burdens. Let's shift gears now to another kind of peril, one that trades stench for a different sort of threat. Stick with me as we explore a line of work where every day feels like tempting fate in a whole new way. Let's shift from the stench of cesspit cleaning to a danger that lurks beneath the earth itself. We're talking about medieval mining, a job so brutal it often felt like carving out your own grave. Picture yourself heading into the depths of a place like the Ramelsburg silver mines in the Holy Roman Empire, chasing salt, iron, or silver, knowing full well that each day could be your last. This wasn't just tough labor. It was a relentless battle against the ground you stood on, with no safety to fall back on. In the Middle Ages, miners worked with nothing more than crude picks, hammers, and sheer grit. They weren't digging in tidy, supported shafts. No, these were shaky tunnels, deep underground, with walls that could collapse without warning. Imagine being hundreds of feet below the surface, surrounded by rock that might crush you at any moment. Every swing of your tool was a risk, not just for ore, but for whether you'd make it back to daylight. The earth didn't care about your life or the family waiting for you above. It was a silent, unforgiving foe. Here's the harsh truth. There was no fresh air down there. You're choking on toxic dust with every breath, the kind that tore at your lungs bit by bit. Historical estimates suggest this dust, often from silica, contributed to devastating health decline, with many miners showing signs of respiratory failure in skeletal remains. On top of that, tunnels had no proper bracing. A small tremor or a misplaced strike, and the whole shaft could come down, trapping you in a suffocating tomb with no hope of rescue. You lived with the constant dread of being buried alive, knowing no one would dig you out. Picture crawling into a damp, pitch-black shaft, your only light from flickering torches that barely showed the next spot to strike. But those flames were a deadly gamble. Flammable gases like methane are often built up in the tight spaces, and one spark could trigger a catastrophic explosion. Every step into that darkness was a roll of the dice, with no promise you'd climb out alive. You couldn't even trust the dim glow guiding you. It might just as easily be the end of everything. Historical records paint a grim picture. Osteological analyses of mining communities reveal that about 50% of miners didn't survive past age 30. If the dust didn't destroy their lungs, sudden collapses often did. One moment you're chipping at ore, the next you're under tons of rubble with no way out. Whole crews could vanish in a heartbeat when the ground gave way, their fates reduced to hushed stories. It wasn't about if disaster would strike, but when your job had a built-in countdown. Think about toiling for hours in spaces so tight you couldn't stand upright. You're bent over, muscles burning, hauling rocks in air so heavy it choked you. And it wasn't just adults enduring this. Children as young as 10 were sent down, lugging heavy loads up narrow paths until their bodies broke. Their spines twisted under the strain, deformed before they even grew up. Imagine a kid, barely old enough to understand the danger, trapped in deadly tunnels with no sunlight, just endless labor until they couldn't go on. There were no safety measures, not even the basics. If a tunnel fell, no one pointed to poor planning or weak supports. They'd say you didn't pray enough, ignoring how lords set impossible quotas, forcing you to dig faster and deeper even as cracks appeared. You weren't a person with rights, you were just a means to their wealth. If you died, another desperate soul would take your place. Your life was worth less than the ore you pulled from the dirt. Those quotas were merciless. You had to meet a set amount of ore daily, no matter the exhaustion or danger. Fall short, and you might not eat. Or worse, face punishment. So, you kept going, ignoring the warning rumbles, because failing meant your family starved. Every painful swing of your pick came from desperation. Modern ideas like breaks or fair pay? Not a chance. This was a grind that spared no one. Despite the horror, mining wasn't something you could walk away from. Many were bound by feudal ties, just like serfs, unable to refuse without losing everything. Options were scarce for those at the bottom, and quitting often swapped one hardship for another. The pay was a bit better than farming, but at what cost? A few extra coins couldn't buy back your health or the years stolen by the mines. You kept at it, hoping to survive just one more day. It's a stark look at how little worth was placed on those who fueled the medieval world from its darkest corners. Miners weren't seen as vital. They were disposable, used up, and replaced without a thought. The toll on their bodies, minds, and families was immense. Every piece of ore stained with a cost no one counted back then. Now let's step out of the mines and into a different kind of danger. One where your lack of choice could pull you into a fight you never wanted. Stick around to see how far that powerlessness could push you. Let's move from the dark depths of the mines to a threat that could snatch you from your fields without warning. We're talking about peasant soldiers, ordinary folks dragged into battle under feudal obligation, as seen in legal statutes like the scutage regulations from 1296 records. After facing deadly risks underground, you might think nothing could be worse, but being forced into a lord's war brought a terror all its own. This wasn't a choice. It was a brutal demand that could cost you everything. When medieval lords clashed with rivals, they didn't just rely on armored knights. They called up peasants like you to swell their ranks as foot soldiers, bound by the feudal system to serve with no way to refuse. This wasn't about signing up for honor or adventure. Living on a lord's land meant you owed him everything, including your life in his fights. Whether you'd ever held a weapon or not, when the summons came, you had to march. Your existence was tied to his whims, and war was just another way he claimed ownership over you. Here's the harsh reality. They might toss you a rusty spear if you were lucky, or sometimes just a farm tool, and send you against enemies trained to kill. Imagine being a farmer, skilled at tending crops, now facing knights in steel or seasoned fighters who could strike you down in a heartbeat. Lords didn't bother with giving you proper gear or teaching you to fight. Your purpose wasn't victory, it was to bulk up the army's numbers. You were thrown into the fray with nothing to protect you, expected to somehow hold your own against impossible odds. Picture standing on a soggy battlefield, mud sucking at your boots, with no armor and no idea how to defend yourself. All around, there's chaos, shouts, the clash of steel, arrows slicing through the air from unseen bows. You've got a flimsy weapon at best, and your only thought is surviving long enough to see home again. Running isn't an option. Desertion meant your own side would track you down and punish you as a traitor. You're caught between a deadly enemy ahead and brutal consequences behind, with nowhere to turn but forward into the fight. Historical accounts reveal the grim fate of these peasant levies. Commanders often used you as the first wave, sent to wear down the enemy before the skilled fighters joined in. You'd be ordered to the front, charging into arrow storms or scaling fortified walls, while knights waited for a safer moment. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, as noted in the Black Prince's accounts and Froissart's chronicles, French peasant soldiers bore the brunt of English archer fire, suffering casualty rates in the high tens of percent per chronicler sources. You weren't a key asset. You were a shield of flesh, meant to take the hits so others might survive. Think about the sinking feeling of knowing you're not worth protecting. No one's recording your name or grieving if you fall. If a blade or arrow finds you, that's just one less burden for the Lord. There's always another peasant to haul into the next battle, another body to sacrifice. You look at the men beside you, realizing many won't return, and wonder if you'll be next. That constant fear gnaws at you, every step forward a gamble with no promise of making it through. And if you got wounded, that was often a slower, worse fate. Medieval battles had no medics or proper care. A sword slash or arrow wound left you bleeding in the dirt, with no help coming. Even a small cut could fester into a deadly infection, since no one understood cleanliness in wounds. You might drag on for days in pain, with nothing to dull it. Surviving a hit didn't mean relief. It meant lingering suffering with little hope of recovery. The weight wasn't just physical. You weren't fighting for a cause you chose or a belief you held. Refusing your lord's call wasn't an option. Defiance could mean imprisonment, losing your land, or even execution. Your family would suffer too, stripped of home and food if you didn't comply. Every battle risked not just your life, but everyone depending on you. Imagine the despair of knowing one wrong choice could destroy everything you've struggled to keep together. Look at a fight like Agincourt in 1415, detailed in Froissart's works. French peasant soldiers were positioned up front against English longbowmen, taking devastating losses as they trudged through mud under a rain of arrows. Their deaths were barely a footnote to those in command. You were there to fall so the knights could claim glory later. It's a bitter truth. Your life meant so little in the grand tally of war. So why did peasants keep marching into these deadly conflicts? It wasn't bravery or dreams of reward. It was raw desperation, knowing refusal brought ruin just as surely as a battlefield. You fought because you had to, with no safety, no choice, just the faint hope of coming back in one piece. It's a stark reminder of how little control you had over your own fate. Now imagine if you tried to speak out against this kind of treatment, to demand something better than being used and discarded. Stick around to see what happened when peasants dared to challenge the system that bound them. Let's turn to the perilous act of standing up to a system that holds you in chains. We're diving into the deadly gamble of demanding better conditions in medieval times, a move so risky it often became a death wish. You might think after enduring serfdom, cesspit cleaning, mining, and forced battles, pushing back against a lord's grip would be worth a shot. But let me tell you, speaking out back then wasn't seen as courage. It was a direct challenge to an order that crushed any hint of defiance with brutal force. Peasants who dared to demand fairer treatment or lighter burdens weren't met with understanding. They were viewed as dangers to the feudal structure, a system built to keep nobles in power and everyone else underfoot. Lords didn't maintain their wealth through mercy. They relied on your endless toil and absolute obedience. If you muttered about grueling field work or taxes that left you starving, you weren't just a nuisance, you were threatening their entire way of life. Imagine the sheer guts it took to voice even a whisper of discontent when everything around you demanded your silence. Here's the brutal truth. Complain about a lord's orders, and you might face a public flogging, a dank prison cell, or a noose as a grim example to others. Even small protests could bring savage beatings to keep the rest in line. But if you joined a larger uprising, the response was often mass slaughter. Lords had soldiers, weapons, and legal backing, while you had little more than raw anger and a makeshift tool. Standing up wasn't just daring, it was a gamble where losing meant your life. Picture risking it all for something as basic as a fairer tax. Take the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, where thousands rose against crushing levies and harsh treatment. They weren't chasing riches, just a poll tax that didn't drain their last coin. These desperate folks stormed courts, torched records to wipe out debts, and even killed royal officials in their rage. But the backlash was ruthless. As many as 1,500 lost their lives in the fighting and unrest, with historical accounts like John of Reading's Chronicle noting key leaders faced execution. The uprising was smashed without mercy, a stark lesson in the cost of demanding even a shred of justice. Historical records show lords used unrelenting violence to quash any resistance. After the 1381 revolt, Richard II's regime unleashed the bloody assize, executing 31 men to reassert control, as detailed in county assize records. The king's own words cut deep. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. This wasn't just a rejection, it was a promise to tighten the chains for anyone foolish enough to try again. Your plea for relief could turn your world to ruin, leaving nothing but fear in its wake. Think about the despair that settled in after such failures. There were no groups to support you, no laws to shield you, just a rigged setup designed to break you. Quitting your role as a serf or refusing a lord's call wasn't like walking away from a bad job. Try to flee and you'd be an outlaw hunted with nowhere to turn. Villages knew each other too well. No one would shelter a runaway and risk their own skin. You'd be out there, alone and starving, or dragged back for a public lesson. Modern escapes like a new career or a fresh town. Pure fantasy. You were trapped. End of story. The punishment didn't stop with you. Lords knew targeting your family was the ultimate leash. Join a protest or dodge a war levy, and they might seize your scrap of land, leaving your loved ones to starve. Worse, they could punish them outright, making everyone tied to you an example. Imagine the heart-wrenching dilemma. Stay quiet and endure, or speak out and see everyone you love suffer for it. Your fight for better wasn't just personal. It dragged in every soul depending on you. Even later revolts followed the same grim path. The Jack Cade Rebellion of 1450, driven by high taxes and corrupt rule, saw peasants march on London and lash out in desperation. Like 1381, both uprisings met harsh reprisals, with heavy casualties as noted in medievalhistory.info statistics. The pattern never wavered. Step out of bounds, and the system hit back with lethal force. Every attempt at change was met with a wall of violence, proving how little room there was for hope. Even the courts offered no refuge. Manor hearings, run by the Lord's men, twisted justice to suit the powerful. Customary law bent to their will, not yours. In the king's courts, under common law, you stood alone with no voice. Tactics like peine forte et dure, crushing you under weights to force a plea, showed fairness was a myth. If you thought some higher authority might save you, think again. The law was just another weapon to keep you bound. So why risk it all when the price was so steep? The cold fact is, pushing for better often led to death or worse. Medieval society wasn't made for reform, and peasants paid dearly for trying. Refusing orders or joining a revolt usually ended with execution, battle, or drawn-out torment. Survival meant harsher rules, as lords clamped down to kill any future spark. You'd lose everything, and so would those around you, just for wanting a life less cruel. Now let's take a moment to reflect on how much has changed since those brutal times. Stick with me to put all this hardship into perspective, and see why your everyday struggles might not seem so bad after all. Let's wrap this up with a hard look at how far we've come since those grueling medieval days. In conclusion, I'm driving home the gap between then and now. Back then, peasants faced 12 to 16-hour workdays with no safety laws, no breaks, just raw danger at every turn. Today, we've got protections and rights that took centuries of struggle to win. Your 9-to-5 nightmare doesn't compare to their reality. Sounds brutal. Tell me which job truly shocked you in the comments. Hit like if you're thankful for modern comforts. Subscribe for more brutal history you won't believe.